Hello there everyone, uxwbill here once again with a long overdue episode of kitchen table electronics repair. Today I'm going to be taking a look at a couple different pieces, some of which will be repaired and some of which will simply merit some further explanation and some of which will actually be reserved for future videos. What you're looking at here, this particular wreck, isn't nearly as serious as it seems. This is, or maybe at this point I should say was, a Technics quartz synthesized TV FM AM stereo receiver, model number SA-946. Now those of you who watch fellow YouTube user VWestlife's videos will undoubtedly recognize this receiver, and yes, it is exactly the same unit. Years later, after I sent him the matching AM loop antenna, he decided to sell the stereo receiver, and I, of course, having the interest that I do in 1980s vintage Technics stereo equipment, I decided to acquire it from him. Now this thing's problem is pretty simple. It's suffering from bad solder joints. When you engage certain functions on the front panel, such as when you choose a source, even though all the buttons are missing from it right now, they're simply laying over here. You can see they're actually labeled as to what they do. Sometimes the corresponding indicator light in the front panel will not actually happen to illuminate unless you slap the receiver around a little bit. And I know that it's done this for as long as he's had it, I would guess, but maybe even longer than that. Solder problems are not something that I would say these receivers are particularly well known for, but for some reason my SA-560, which is a slightly fancier version of this, featuring an MTS and secondary audio program television audio decoder, had the same problem as well. I don't know if it's due to the amount of heat these things generate or what, but if we take a very careful look at this board here, I'll go ahead and zoom in. You might be able to see, I think you can see it pretty well right there. You can certainly see it right there. The cracks around the solder joints that held these LEDs in. So this in and of itself is a pretty simple fix. Now this receiver has another small problem. There's a light that comes on, at least when it feels like it, that illuminates this plastic bezel over all of these front panel indicators. It's kind of a nice touch, and I wonder if my SA-560 is supposed to do that as well. I've never actually had it apart far enough to know, but I did touch up all the solder joints on it. Well, every now and again that light goes out, and I came to know that it's actually located on this little printed circuit board right here. Well, I took this out thinking I'd find a bad solder joint, and I never did. There is the most unique kind of tube-shaped bulb that I have ever seen in there. I've never seen anything like it, and all I can guess is that perhaps the filament in that bulb is intermittent, so I'm simply going to leave that alone and hope that it continues shining for at least a little while, because I'm really not looking forward to the time when that bulb finally does experience a failure. Other than that, there's really not a whole lot of work this stereo receiver needs, though as with anything that's approaching 30 years of age, it might be time to start thinking about replacing capacitors and things like that. You can see that the circuit board has been a little hot here in this clump of capacitors and other components. There's two resistors that seem to have been responsible for most of the heat, and there's one capacitor right here, C624, which appears that maybe it's leaked a little bit of its electrolyte over time, and it should probably be replaced sooner rather than later. I also discovered something else interesting as I moved the tuning microprocessor board out of the way. I don't know if someone was tinkering around in this receiver or, trying to tap some sort of a tuner output or something in hopes of maybe adding AM stereo decoding capability or even passing the signal on to an outboard AM stereo decoder. But what I did notice is that one of these wire shunts, you can see it there a couple positions down from R290, has been disconnected and appears to have been rejoined once again with solder. Going a little further down, you can also see that the other two there have been fiddled with a little bit. So I don't know, maybe this receiver was repaired by somebody, maybe somebody attempted to modify it. It's really hard to tell, but I've got my soldering iron warmed up, so let's go ahead and take a crack at these bad solder joints on the front panel board. Now, I really don't consider myself particularly good at soldering things, and I certainly don't think I'm the person you should try to take soldering lessons from. In fact, I strongly recommend that you look up such tutorials online if you really want to learn how to solder stuff properly. But it seems that a lot of people have said, you know, you should show what you're doing when you actually repair something. So guess what? I'm going to go ahead and do that. I'll just embarrass myself in front of all of you here on YouTube. Now, when I worked on my SA-560, I noticed that all of the solder that Matsushita Electric had initially put on this thing pretty much disappeared when I touched it with the iron. And this is no different, because before I started the camera, I actually touched this solder joint over here, and the solder just kind of went down the through hole and didn't really make a better solder joint. So I'm just going to go ahead and touch this up by adding a little bit of solder here. Just go ahead and heat things up a little tiny bit. There we go. Now we've got a good solder joint on that one. Got to be very careful to avoid bridging these. There we go. Not all of these are cracked, but when you're in for a penny, you're in for a pound. And fate would practically guarantee that if I didn't do all of these right now, I would end up doing them again very shortly. Well, that one's not really turning out the way I'd like. There we go. One of the problems with my soldering stuff is that I tend to shake a little bit, and there's nothing I can do about it. It actually runs in the family, that kind of... I think they call it an essential tremor, is what I've heard in the past. Of course, don't let your finger get too close to the solder as you feed it into the joint, because here's something you might not have known. Solder is actually kind of a good conductor of heat. There we go. I should probably be using a slightly more powerful iron for this. I don't use anything terribly fancy in my soldering activities. It's just a 15-watt grounded Radio Shack iron, and I haven't really seen the need for anything better, but there's all of those LEDs resoldered once again. Everything else on this board seems to work, and an examination of the solder joints didn't really show any other problematic ones. Though if you go looking for troublesome solder joints on your own, well, you should certainly be very, very careful, because they can hide very well, sometimes so much so that you'd actually have to flex a component on the print board in order to see the solder joint on the back acting up and moving around when it shouldn't. Nothing that has been soldered to a board should move around to any appreciable degree. So now it's basically time to start putting the old stereo receiver back together. But there is one problem I forgot to mention, more of an inconvenience than anything else. When V-Westlife sent me this receiver, I soon discovered that the remote speaker switch did not appear to function. You could push it down and it wouldn't actually latch. Now, the main speaker switch seemed to work okay, and at first blush you might think, well, that's got to be a mechanical problem in the switch, probably bad, you'll need to replace it. But in this case, time, wear, and maybe just a little tiny bit of abuse have conspired to cause the problem that's making the remote speaker switch non-functional. You can see right here there's a clip that holds the circuit board in place, and at some point it has cracked off of the mounting post that once held it into place, which means the only real support that this particular front panel board has is through the headphone connector on the front panel. And that's not really a good way to do anything. But if I hold this board up such that it can't scoot backwards, and then I press the remote speaker switch, you'll see that it now works exactly the way it's supposed to, because it can't back away. I think the fix for this is probably to either try melting that clip back together, which might work, or to simply use some hot glue. Obviously, the manufacturing process, whoever was responsible for that at Technics, was inclined to think that this might be a problem, because it looks like there's some hot glue here. Of course, I am making the assumption that someone didn't try to add that later when it broke, but I think that's a pretty fair assumption to make, because the color of the glue makes me think that it's been in there for a while. We'll go ahead and just have a shot at fixing that here. As I mentioned previously, putting the front panel board back together is really not quite as involved as it looks. You're basically layering things back together until the whole thing is ready to be put on the front, mounted to the chassis of the receiver as a whole, and everything reconnected. The only moderately hairy part of it is these tinned connectors that they use to connect various parts of the front panel to other parts of the receiver. Fortunately, they are labeled and marked as to where pin 1 is in case you get one flipped over, and they're not too terribly bad. They actually use pretty decent quality connectors with little latching things that open up to make insertion of the wires easy. One very nice touch, and I just dropped it here on the circuit board. That was a smart thing to do. We'll have to get that back. See if I can actually get it to where I can reach it. There we go. Are these little plastic push clips that actually hold all the major circuit boards to the front panel. You can see I'm putting the LED and indicator board back in there now. The tuning controller board and the display board also fits in with a series of those little plastic push pin like things, and all you have to do is just make sure the circuit board is lined up, set the push pin into place, and then push it down, and the circuit board is held into place very cleverly and surprisingly securely. Well, let me just say before I continue that sometimes, even when you've got a few of these things under your belt already, experience can still teach you a thing or two, and in this case it taught me that in the delicate ballet of putting the front panel back into place, it's really a good idea to go ahead and not attach this circuit board with all the LED indicator lights and the stereoplex indicator until after you have actually gotten the front bezel put into place and before you go ahead and put the tuning board into place. Now it appears that I lost the tuning light in the course of working on this thing, because if you look very carefully inside of it, and I don't know if the camcorder can focus that close up or even if you'll be able to see it after everything has gotten through with it, but it looks like the filament has actually just kind of collapsed in there and is no longer making electrical contact. So I won't be too terribly surprised if that doesn't actually work when I go to put the unit all the way back together. The last piece of assembly that remains, you can see I already did the power button over here, are these various front panel buttons, and these are not nearly as hard as you might think they would look to actually do. Fortunately, the circuit board gives us some guidance here as to which one of these represents what function. You can see that they're labeled as to what they do. They say tape 1, tape 2, tuner, phono, so even though we can't see what all of them do, it's possible by process of elimination to figure it out nevertheless. So we know that phono goes all the way in over here on the end, and the way you do these is very simple. You just slide them in until they move into the appropriate position, and you might need to brace it a little bit with your fingers, but when it's on the peg that represents the control, you just give it a push, and it'll go ahead and click into place, and then you can go ahead and do the next one, which in this case is tuner. And the same thing applies. Lather, rinse, repeat. You just never know when the most random of objects are going to become handy in your repair area, as this can of fruit punch did when it came to keeping the coax cable leading to my signal splitter from falling off the edge of the workbench. Alright everybody, it's time to see if I've been fixing it nearly long enough, and if it is now successfully broken, go ahead and push in the power button here and just see what happens. Smoke test! Nothing blew up. Protection relay clicked, so we're probably good on that. Unfortunately, it definitely does appear as though we have lost the tuning display light bulb and the front panel lamp as well, but our LEDs seem to all be in fine working trim. They're certainly much brighter than they were before. At first I was of the impression that maybe a couple of them had simply dimmed with age because they'd been used so much more than any of the others. Now I've gone ahead and hooked up some speakers to the remote speaker output, and I'm so confident that this thing still works because it came out of DC protection and all that I'm just going to push the button here and hope for the best. Let's see what we hear. Well, I got some static. It's a little bit hard to use the tuner in its current state, but it is possible because you can probably see that the display is just barely illuminated. So let's see if we can find a station here. something that's actually broadcasting in the area. I think, being as this came from V Westlife, and he always comments on it, that the so-called piano music station is as good a bet as any. To round out the repairs on this unit, there were a couple boo-boos in the metalwork on the right-hand side panel, and unfortunately I'm nobody's idea of a sheet metal artist. I should probably get Furhead to work on this a little bit, but I've gone ahead and made them at least better than they are. There's still a little bit of an irregularity down here by the screw that I didn't initially notice, and there was another one up here that was actually splayed out to the point where you could see it past the plastic edge. So once I get the lighting all fixed up on this thing, it should be in pretty good fighting trim once again. And of course I'll certainly give some serious thought to going ahead and recapping it. And then there's this thing. A really nice looking and matching Technics compact disc player, model number SL-P230. Pretty nice piece of equipment. The display doesn't look to have too terribly many hours on it. A really nice CD player in every regard except for one. If you pop a CD in there, everything comes up just like it should. You hit play, and guess what, folks? You don't hear anything. Now, at first you might be inclined to think that such a problem indicates a convoluted and potentially difficult to solve failure in this thing's audio decoding or digital to analog conversion hardware. But as with many electronic problems of a serious nature, the biggest problems, the ones that impact a device's functionality the most, oftentimes have the simplest root causes. And it didn't take me more than about a minute's worth of poking around inside this compact disc player before I finally discovered the problem. I'll go ahead and zoom in on the output jacks here and show you something extremely interesting that happens when I press down on the contact finger. Watch very carefully here. You see that? That's not supposed to happen. I'm sure you saw it and heard it snap back like that too. So apparently the day they were soldering things in the Matsushita Electric factory where this CD player was assembled, they must have been slacking a little bit. Maybe this thing was built on a Saturday, who knows. But it certainly has bad solder joints in common with the SA-946 before it. Now, getting this thing apart is a little bit different than the usual. There are other things about this player that are definitely very different as well. First of all, if you look at the laser sled, you'll notice that it floats. This actually works by magnetic levitation and repulsion, as opposed to a simple DC permanent magnet motor that runs the laser sled back and forth via a gear train. It's a very interesting mechanism, and it allows for very fast seek times and nearly silent operation as well. Pretty neat idea. But one thing you must be sure of if you ever come across a CD player like this, or you happen to own one, is that prior to transporting it, you make sure to press in the lock button that secures the laser sled in place. If you don't, the laser sled will be allowed to slam around, coming to a harsh stop against each of its stopping points, and it may actually knock the optics inside the unit apart. But that's not the only thing that makes this CD player unique. It's intended to come apart from the front. That's right. You're meant to take the front panel off and disconnect the circuit boards before you can actually take the primary circuit board out of the unit. Its construction is definitely quite a bit of a departure from the more usual design where the back panel of the unit comes off. You can see that is quite impossible to do here without getting violent with it and actually bending it off, which is not a good idea. So let's go ahead and get started with taking this thing apart. As with more conventionally designed CD players, the first thing you need to do is to eject the tray, shut the power off, and then detach the front decorative bezel from the compact disc tray. Otherwise, you will run into quite the problem when you go to take the actual front panel off of the machine. The front panel is actually disconnected from the rest of the machine by way of a series of screws alongside the bottom. Looks like there's just two holding it on in this case, and maybe some hidden ones on the feet. We'll have to take a look at that and see. You can also capture a better look at how the laser sled mechanism in this particular player works. Truly a unique and very high quality mechanism, even in a relatively basic player with few buttons and few built-in functions on it, such as this one. The front panel has now been removed from the unit, as you can very clearly see. We'll definitely want to be careful with this when the time to put it back together comes along, because it looks like those metal connectors that mate with these connections at the front of the main circuit board are actually a little bit fragile and probably wouldn't take very kindly to being crammed on there in the wrong way. This ribbon cable leading to the compact disc player electronics actually unplugs, and then there are more of these lovely tinned wire style connectors that we love so much, but once again, it doesn't look like it's a terribly huge deal to free those up and then be able to remove the main circuit board from the unit. With the board freed from the unit and turned over, the problem becomes readily apparent. You can see right here are the connections for the left channel and the right channel, as well as the common or ground connection. And even though the common connection looks secure, it flexes a little bit when I go ahead and move the plastic framework that holds the two output jacks in place. And if I look very closely at, say, the right channel connector, which is right there, you might just be able to see the extent of the break when I push on it. Oh yeah, you definitely can. You see that black area in there? That's where the solder joint has cracked after years and years of abuse. I would say this was badly soldered because there's certainly not a surplus of solder on here to hold it in place, and given that this unit is in otherwise good condition, I really don't think someone spent a lot of time shuffling it around between stereo receivers or even abusing it all that much. But these jacks have to bear a certain amount of abuse, just as the RCA cables that plug into them are connected and disconnected. Even so, there is a means of support at the back provided by a single screw that should be more than sufficient. So simply hitting these with the soldering iron and putting a little more solder on there just to bolster them up a little bit should do just fine to get this thing making music again. Rather surprising for a late 1980s compact disc player is the high amount of integration that you see on this circuit board. The primary functions are centered across 3 different integrated circuits, well, 4 different integrated circuits if you count this one over here, which is probably a buffer memory chip. And then of course a bunch of passive components on the other side. You can contrast that to a lot of other mid to late 1980s CD players where some integration was definitely taking place, but there were still a pretty fair amount of discrete components to be found on the board instead of a highly integrated and compact design such as this. And if we take another look at those after I gave all 3 of them a little tiny kiss with the soldering iron and put a little more solder on there as well to give them more strength, you can see that the left and right channel outputs look a good deal better. The ground looks kind of nasty, but it didn't look that great to start with. However, it is once again anchored securely to the board. So it's time to throw this CD player back together and see if it happens to produce any music now. Although this thing is definitely not 100% back together yet, it's more than good enough for a test to see if what we have now is more like a CD player than what we had before. So we'll go ahead and pop this CD in here. For those of you wondering about the music, this is from a band known as the Tractors. This is their self-titled 1994 album. It is, as I have said on some of my live streaming broadcasts, one of those rare CDs that start to finish. It is an excellent musical ride, and really I need to expand my collection of work by this particular group because I would certainly like to hear some of their other songs, even though they're really only known for one song, and that's Baby Likes to Rock It. Let's go ahead and kick this off and just see what happens here.
All across the South, they got the boogie bands that sound so free. And on both coasts, they got the record company machine, turning out hits, assembly line. But in the heart of America.
Finally, finishing up this somewhat impressive parade of audio equipment repairs and demonstrations are the graphic equalizers. I never miss a year when the public radio and television station in this area has their used stereo equipment benefit sale, and this year it seemed that it was the season for equalizers. I picked up this realistic 5-band stereo unit. Oddly enough, despite its being arguably the cheapest and perhaps even the least well-regarded of everything that I saw there, it worked perfectly out of the box. I also picked up a silver-faced Technics Equalizer. And then the real prize of the bunch, this is probably a crime. I probably stole this thing. This is a very impressive Soundcraftsmen graphic equalizer. Very well-regarded brand. The company seemingly later became a part of MTX sometime in the early 1990s. But this thing needs a little bit of love. You can see that its previous owner obviously enjoyed it quite a bit from the looks of things, and it looks like maybe it spent some time mildewing along nicely in a basement. But like I said, it was probably a crime what I ended up paying for this thing. No joke. And I'm not sure if I actually got back there and bought this at the half price point of the sale or not. I'm going to say that I didn't, because I really didn't think it would still be there. But if I gave $2.50 for that, it might well be the crime of the century. If you take a look at the internals of this thing, I've been cleaning the controls on it, which is really all it needs, a very, very good control cleaning. You can see that it's quite a bit different internally from a modern graphic equalizer, which would use a purpose-built integrated circuit in all likelihood to do what this one is doing with various passive components and tuned coils that just by their very look says, adjust me, and you risk throwing yourself into a whole wide evening worth of fun. So definitely not something to play with unless you know what you're doing. It does appear that maybe someone has been in here over time, as these boards are completely symmetrical versions of one another for both the right and left channels. And it looks like a few of the electrolytic capacitors, namely these black ones, have been replaced over the years. So maybe someone has serviced this thing. I would guess that this has to be from around the mid-1970s, maybe the earlier portion of the 1970s. Truly an amazing piece of gear, and I didn't just get the unit itself, I also got the cabinet that it fits in, and while it could stand some cleanup and has a few boo-boos on it, it is in remarkable condition for its age and should clean up nicely. And then finally, rounding out everything that you've seen so far tonight, is another Technics Equalizer. This was one that I picked up from the Goodwill. I think I gave about $7 for it, and that was probably about $20 too much. The reason I say that has to do with the fact that when you turn the equalizer circuit on, the output completely vanished. And so what I did, you can actually see my notes over here, I traced this circuit out, and I determined that the signal was getting past the equalizer on-off switch, and then it was going into this Toshiba operational amplifier over here and never coming out again. Now the power supplies to that IC are good. Everything seems to be going to it, but nothing's coming out of it at all. So I'm guessing that the operational amplifier integrated circuit in this equalizer is probably bad. And I'm really on the fence about repairing it, not only because the part itself is long since obsolete and it appears that it'll be about $10 worth of my money to find one, but also because I'm going to need a replacement switch. I actually was cleaning the contacts in this switch, some of which were quite dirty, and something went pling, and it's been lost into the corners of my basement forever. I don't think I'm very likely to find that, so probably got to replace that switch, and that looks like it'll be another $5 to $6 by the time shipping and gouging and everything like that is tacked on. So even though this equalizer is in pretty good condition and the controls all seem to work very nicely, though obviously I can't tell if they're dirty when there's no audio coming out of the unit when you put the equalizer in circuit, it seems that, I don't know. I'm definitely on the fence about whether to repair this one or just to let it go. Maybe use it as parts for something else, because it certainly seems that I'd be spending more money than I've got in it. And you know, sometimes it's actually worthwhile doing that. Other times it's simply best to cut your losses. And I'm slightly leaning toward the side of cutting my losses. Well, this has been another very long video from uxwbill featuring some demonstrations of audio equipment, some kitchen table electronics repairs. I'd like to thank you for watching, and by all means, feel free to leave a comment if you have one.